This is the Enochs Show, America's most controversial podcast, coming to you live from UNT. That's the University of North Texas. In my studio this evening, we have
Brock Bergen.
Jackson Carter Pullmeyer.
with that war hero name.
War
You
hero
have a
name.
name. You can run for Congress
I'll do
of
it.
the United States of America. Just
Don't tempt me.
based on your name alone. Well, in our across the way, are you in Louisiana right now, Dr. Block?
I am in British Columbia, Canada.
Wow, you're a world traveler. I've met him in New Jersey. Do you know one thing you have in common, Dr. Block, with Barack Obama?
Tell me.
Both of you graduated from Columbia University.
Oh, okay, good. Me and Obama, great.
That's probably the only thing you guys have in common. Anyways, before we get into our eminent guest, Dr. Walter Block, we have sports with Brock. Brock, what's going on, man, with Colorado? Is this hype?
Yeah, I mean, they beat two. First off, they beat two really regressing teams. They beat TCU and Nebraska, and then they beat Colorado State. And then here we go with the whole national championship hype once again. They're like storming the field when they were favored by 23 points. It's gotten out of control at this point.
So Travis Hunter has a lacerated kidney.
Yeah, after one hit he took the other day from a Colorado State cornerback that put him out for the rest of the game because of it.
I guess he's out for a couple games. It's unfortunate. If
Yeah.
anybody, Dr. Block, I'm not certain if you follow sports, but there's a University of Colorado player who unusually gifted player who plays both ways, plays defense and offense.
Yep.
And he got hurt pretty bad in a late hit in a game against Colorado State. It's really unfortunate. But the player that did that hit, made that late hit, is getting death threats.
Yeah, people have been like on Twitter campaigning for them to take away his like football scholarship, take away his just rights to playing and all that. And it's gotten so bad to the point where Deion Sanders himself told them to leave him alone too.
Yeah, I saw that. Moving on from that, Jackson Carter Pullmeyer.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Give us another take on the issue of altered states. Walter, we have Walter Block in Canada right now, the eminent libertarian scholar. Did you ever see a movie like 40 years ago called Altered States? Walter?
No, I never saw that movie.
Yeah, it's kind of an unusual film that we've been talking about this semester about deprivation tank, where he goes into it. He actually devolves an evolutionary chain every time he goes. He takes peyote and goes into this chamber. So, from your take on it, like any other? Oh, one thing I wanted to say when I was watching a little bit of it last week after I talked to you, man, the graphics in it are weak. The graphics in the early 80s were bad.
You thought so? I thought they were interesting personally. It's just so much different than the boring CGI that you see today. I thought it was pretty cool. I mean, that might just be me looking at it from like a retro point of view. You grew up on that sort of thing, but when I see it, I'm like, oh, this is old school. This is really sweet. That's
That looks like Pong or Space Invaders. That looks
Yeah.
so weak, But anyways, well, ladies and gentlemen, we got Walter Block, the libertarian scholar. Walter, before we launch into some issues here, can you tell us your connection of Ayn Rand again? You in 1960s, you were a college student and you met her when you were at Brooklyn College. Is that correct?
That's right. That's right. I went to high school with Bernie Sanders. We were on the track team together, and my views were roughly the same as his. And Ayn Rand came to Brooklyn College to lecture, and I came to boo and hiss her. In those days, you didn't really cancel any. It was polite booing and hissing. Nowadays, you prevent her from speaking. But we weren't into that then. We leftists. I was a leftist then. I just wanted to, show my disdain for her because she favored economic freedom, which we know is fascism. That was my view then. But what happened after her speech was it was announced that the Ayn Rand Studies Club, or whatever they were called, I'm not sure that's the exact name, had a lunch in her honor, and anyone could come, even if you disagreed with her. And I came, and there was this long, long table, maybe 50 people on each side, 100 people, and Ayn Rand was sitting at the head of the table, and her chief lieutenants, Ellen Greenspan, Nathaniel Brandon, Leonard Peikoff, were all sitting over there, and there was no room there, so I sat at the other end of the table, and I turned to my neighbor and I said, well, this capitalism is evil, socialism is the way to go. And he said, well, I don't really know that much about it, but the people that do are at the other end of the table. So I went up there. I was a chutzpahnik then, pushy, and I stuck my head in between Ayn Rand's and Nathaniel Brannan's, and I said, there's a socialist here who wants to debate someone on socialism and capitalism. And Brandon said, who was that? And I said, me. And I was, a college student, maybe 20 years old, and Brandon maybe 35, and Rand 50 years old, roughly. This was in 1962 or 3. Yeah. No, maybe, yeah, around 62 or 63. And Brandon was very nice. He said, look, there's no room at this end of the table. Let's go to the other end of the table and talk about it. But if I do that with you, it'll only be under 2 conditions. One condition is you have to read 2 books that I'll recommend, which was Atlas Shrugged and Economics in One Lesson by Henry Hazlitt. And you have to promise not to let the discussion lapse with this one time, but we continue it until we settle it. And I promised. And he came to the other end of the table, and we talked, and he didn't convince me. But over the weekend, I read both books, and Atlas Shrugged is, 1,200 pages, but I couldn't put it down. And then I went to his house and Ayn Rand's house over the next couple of weeks, months. I went with my roommate, Ben Klein, who was a professor of economics later on. We were undergraduates at the time. And I was converted. I was then a limited government libertarian. And I owe it to Ayn Rand and Atlas Shrugged, which still is one of my favorite books, my favorite novel. And I read it every 10 years, and I get more out of it every 10 years. And that's my story of how I became a limited government libertarian philosopher or advocate.
That's very good. I met Walter in 2016. We had a libertarian club, a kind of a combination club from students at Princeton University and Princeton Theological Seminary. And a friend of mine, Andy Liu, economics student, organized this event where we had Walter Block come out and speak to our campus. It was a pretty big turnout. And I interviewed you. Now, I need to send you this video, Walter. I keep telling you about it, but I actually have a 15-minute video that no one's ever seen before of just you and me at Princeton University. And I just ask you several economics questions. And it's on my iPad to this day. And greatly appreciative of, a lot of people would wonder, why would a Christian guy like myself, and I'm strongly devout Christian, as many of you guys know, I'm not a secular conservative. Some people have accused me, but I'm a very devout believer in Christ. Why would I have an atheistic libertarian scholar on my show? Well, unlike William F. Buckley, who was a very staunch Catholic who repudiated Ayn Rand and pretty much everything she held for, I eat the meat and spit out the bones, guys. Things I don't agree with Walter Block on, I don't, I don't adhere to. Okay. But the things I really appreciate, limited government. I want the least amount of government interference in my personal life. That's the strongest thing I get from Walter Block. I don't want government interference. I don't want them spying on me. And there are issues, Walter, that we agree on. And other things I'm still working on. Your view of abortion has been a challenge for me for about a decade, and I'm still working through that. But I think of in a book of Acts, it's a New Testament book for some of you guys that don't know about the New Testament. It talks about what happened after Christ went to the cross and the resurrection and all that. The early church, and I actually had a chance to go to Athens, Greece, a number of years ago, But in Acts chapter 17, it talked about these philosophers would just sit around in Athens and talk about every new view that came along. And I have that view. I want to hear what he has to say. I reject the cancel culture where we reject all views that I don't agree with. I actually want to learn and grow in my understanding of the world and economics and politics. And so we're really appreciative. Walter Block teaches economics and other fields down there in Louisiana. I don't know how you do it down there. It's very muggy down there, Dr. Block. When I came down there to visit you 3 or 4 years ago, it was unbearable. You've got used to it, even though you're from New York.
I love New Orleans. I'm a big fan of Loyola University, where I teach, and New Orleans, where Loyola is located.
So a couple things right off the bat we want to get into. Walter, would you say you've written over 100 articles on libertarian politics?
Well, I've written about 700 journal articles and law review articles, and 36 books, maybe 37. I've lost track. And I don't count the number of op-eds. They must be in the thousands because I'm forever writing op-eds. So I do write a lot, and I enjoy it very much.
Wow, that's an inspiration. So, a couple of years ago, I get an email from Walter, and he talked about some students or something were trying to cancel you at your school. But the unusual thing was that many students stood in your behalf at your own school. But I was one of the students that rose up in your defense, this issue of cancel culture. And it brought to mind something that happened this summer. Now, I don't like the summers here in Texas. They're almost enough to drive me out of here. It was ridiculous. 100 degrees for like almost 100 days in a row. It was unbearable. So I said, what am I going to do this summer? Some people would probably think, well, he's just going to read Walter Block books and stuff. I'm not going to lie to you guys. I just listened to Pink Floyd. I got 4 or 5 albums that I wanted to listen to that I've never listened to before. I've only heard a couple songs from Dark Side of the Moon. So I got the album and I probably listened to the Pink Floyd album, Dark Side of the Moon, maybe 50 times. Okay. And something arose this summer simultaneously when I started listening to this is that Roger Walters, the bass guitarist and co-founder of Pink Floyd, was in Germany, and he was doing like part of his from the Wall, the movie From the Wall, and some people rose up on him and said that he needed to be arrested by the German government and his show be canceled, like not being able to. And not only that, that Pink Floyd's Dark Side of the Moon should not be like sold. I mean, just complete cancel Roger Walters, the author of that. He wrote every song of the Dark Side of the Moon. Just cancel him. And so, and basically, it was ridiculous. It was basically saying because he had an authoritarian figure in that movie that seemed like a Nazi, they should cancel his whole project. But if anybody's followed Pink Floyd, The Wall, since 1979, there's been this running theme that a fight against authoritarian government. He was in no way supporting Nazis. It's just that he was wearing a costume of the authoritarian leader, not advocating him, but it's just a role in a play.
Yeah, the character becomes like I think it's like almost a dream sequence or something. But yeah, he's like a fascist demagogue spewing all this hate and stuff. And I've seen clips of that part of the show. It's intense, he's got the black trench coat and everything, but it is like very anti-authoritarian. So
hey, what was that movie, Walter, from the early 70s? It was in Germany in the late 20s with Liza Minnelli. She won the Academy Award. Cabaret. So if you see the movie, the Academy Award winning movie Cabaret, it's about the end of the 1920s, right before the Nazis take power, and they have Nazis in the film. Okay, and also there was that movie there's that famous play in the 80s of Nazi characters. I'm trying to think of But anyways, going by the logic of canceling Roger Walters and Dark Side of the Moon and everything he's trying to do, you would have to like not show any movie that had a Nazi. Are we going to cancel Hogan's Heroes? Are we going to cancel Cabaret? Are we going to just not show these films? But there are people in our culture today that want to. If a movie had a Nazi in it, it offends people, hurts people. So we can't show that. Roger, do you want to? I mean, not Roger, but Walter, do you want to speak to the issue of cancel culture, why it's destructive in our culture?
Well, I'd like to give a libertarian viewpoint on it. I look at the world of culture, economics, politics through these eyeglasses, and these eyeglasses are libertarian. And I might have a new chapter for my forthcoming Defending the Undefendable 4 on cancel culture, because there is a sense in which you can defend cancel culture. Now, look, suppose I start a university, and I call it Walter Block University. And in Walter Block University, everybody has to say how great Walter Block is. And they get canceled if they deviate from worship of Walter Block. Have I violated any libertarian law?
No,
Am
because
I
they set up the that's how they set up the campus, right? That's how they that's how
right? I didn't commit fraud. I didn't say that there was academic freedom. I just said, come to Walter Block University and pray to Almighty Walter. And I'm going to cancel anyone who doesn't. Did I do anything wrong? No, I didn't do anything wrong. Therefore, cancel culture or canceling is not per se a violation of rights, as is murder, rape, theft, arson, fraud, whatever. However, what happened to me was the New York Times was interviewing me about, well, what they were interviewing me about was Rand Paul. And this was in 2014 when Rand had a shot at becoming the Republican nominee for president in 2016. And I didn't know it, but the purpose of the interview was to demean and besmirch Rand Paul. And the way they were going to do it is to say, well, Rand Paul hangs around with weirdos. I was one of the weirdos. So they wanted to get me to say something weird and disgusting and despicable. And they were interviewing me. I don't know, there must have been 2 sessions of 2 hours each, 4 hours of interview. And they wanted to have a gotcha moment. So what happened, they just weren't getting libertarianism. So I gave them one of the most controversial areas in libertarianism, namely a thing called voluntary slavery. So what's voluntary slavery? Voluntary slavery is a person voluntarily sells himself into slavery. Why might a person do that? Well, the example I gave them is, suppose my son, who I love, had a horrible disease and it would cost 50 million to cure him, and I don't have anything like 50 million. But Lee, you're a very rich man, and you've long wanted to have me as a slave, and I could come to your plantation and I could pick cotton and I could give you economics lessons, and you could whip me and even kill me, because this is not indentured servitude. This is actual slavery. So here's the deal, Lee. You give my son's doctors the 50 million and they save his life, and I come to your plantation and I'm now your slave. Is this a valid contract? Well, libertarians are very divided on this. I favor this as a valid contract. The only other person that is on my side on this debate is Robert Nozick, whereas Murray Rothbard and many, many other libertarians think that this is an invalid contract. As in all contracts, both sides gain. I gain because I value my son's life more than my freedom. You, Lee, gain because you value my servitude more than the 50 million you had to pay to get me. So we both gain, at least in the ex ante sense, as in the case of all voluntary trade. And I was telling the New York Times that there's a dispute among libertarians over this. Is it a valid contract or not? And do you know what these people did? In the article, they wrote that I favored actual slavery. actual slavery is coercive slavery, involuntary slavery, where people are forced to work for other people and demeaned and raped and murdered. And some 500 students at Loyola signed a petition saying that I should be fired because I favor actual slavery, which I certainly don't. How could I, as a libertarian, how could I, as a decent person? Any decent person would be against coercive slavery. I'm talking voluntary slavery, which is totally different. Happily, we got about 5,000 signatories saying that I should keep my job. Now, cancel culture and firing professors for views that they don't like is fine if that's what the contract is. But the Loyola contract is it was academic freedom. So what they're doing is engaging in fraud and thinking that they could fire me. Happily, I have tenure. I didn't get fired. I sued the New York Times, and we settled for on the basis that satisfied me. So that was the story of that. So to sum up, I'm not against cancel culture, and I'm not against violating academic freedom per se. I'm only against it if it's fraudulent. And it just so happens that it is fraudulent in virtually every case that's now in the news, because these universities have contracts where they promise academic freedom. They promise not only diversity of race and sex and sexual preference, but also diversity of ideas. And then when they get an idea that's conservative or libertarian and they don't like it, then all of a sudden they want to cancel you. So that would be a summary of my views on cancel culture. Not necessarily per se a violation of rights, but the way it's practiced, absolutely an engaging in fraud.
You know, I've had my own experience with cancel culture. I've had people wanting me to not do this show. I invited a guest on this show. Now I've, unlike other people in this generation, I try to have people from all sides of a perspective. And somebody pushed back and said, "Well, if you're not progressive, I'm not even sure if you should be on campus if you don't have a progressive viewpoint. We don't really think that you should even have a show." And I'm going, "What? Like, we have freedom of speech, here on supposedly on campus." So there was an anti-transgender speaker that came here. Now, I'm not saying I advocate what he was saying or anything, but the person that was responsible for having this really controversial speaker I had on my show, the leader of the Young Conservatives of Texas. And I wanted him to give a defense why he had that speaker on campus. And some people said, "You shouldn't have had him on the show." I said, "What? So we should only have people that have your viewpoint, socialists?" I'm not a socialist. I said, "I'm not going to advocate your view. And if you think I'm going to argue from a perspective of progressivism, I'm not. But I'm going to allow you to have your, with certain parameters, allow you to come on the show and be able to express your view, as long as you do it, with respect and, not, like spouting off hate speech or anything, that you can come on the show." But I think in this generation, something really happened, Walter, since your time when you were in the early 60s to now, where you'd have that free speech movement at UC Berkeley, where it was college students that were arguing for free speech. Now it's flipped, where a lot of college students don't want any dissent from the progressive worldview. And I just repudiate that. I completely say, no, let's have, even on campus here, if it was only conservatives, I'd want the liberals to have a voice. I want to hear both sides on an issue or in between. I want to hear different perspectives. I don't want to shut people down. This is a First Amendment country, allegedly, where speech and the press should be free. And so I'm arguing for that. So, Walter, a very controversial issue we're going to get into now is the issue of Ukraine's war with Russia. Last time we had
Lee, let me interrupt you. Before we get to Ukraine, I just wanted to make another comment or two on cancel culture. One of my favorite things when I lived in New York City was Lincoln Center had a mostly Mozart concert series. They've just canceled that on the grounds that he's a dead white male. You were talking about Nazis before. One of my favorite movies is The Producers. And in The Producers, they had this Springtime for Hitler. It was a spoof, a wonderful comedy, and I'll bet you that wouldn't be allowed to be shown right now. And talking about giving all sides of opinion, I teach a course in environmental economics, and what I like to do is balance it. I have what I do is I put on the blackboard on the top row. I put a moderate left, radical left, moderate right, radical right, and then libertarian, 5 different views. And then the course consists of, well, what are the views of these 5 perspectives on global warming and temperature change and forests and animal extinction and all that. And what I tell my students is, I'm never going to mark you down if you disagree with me. All I want is for you to articulate the view of these 5 perspectives. And one of my textbooks is Al Gore's
Inconvenient
book.
truth.
I'm
Inconvenient
sorry.
truth.
I have my own book, which is much more private property oriented. But the point is, I agree with you fervently about the importance of acquainting students with all perspectives. And the success in my class is whether students can articulate views with which they disagree. And I'm a big fan of John Stuart Mill in his On Liberty, who says that if you don't know the other guy's position, you don't even know your own, because your own is defined in terms of the other guy. So if the other position is not allowed to be spoken, it cheats you out of learning your own position, let alone learning the other position. So I'm sorry I had to interrupt you. I'm now ready to get into Ukraine. So please proceed.
Well, just before we get into this, so Anthony Oliver, we mentioned him last week, but Anthony Oliver's this wrote a protest song, um, "Rich Men of North Richmond," and it's basically talking about corporatism and whatnot. And you can't get ahead today because of the inflation and just bigwigs pretty much are just out for themselves and screwing the worker or whatever. Now the thing about that is that the Republicans tried to claim that Republicans a couple of weeks ago in their debate, their first presidential debate, try to claim that song for themselves. And um, Anthony Oliver said, "No, I'm writing that song about you." I want to be really clear. I reject authoritarianism, whether or not it comes as in progressive or allegedly conservative clothes. I reject authoritarianism. I reject it. Also, these people that are being vicious against transgender people, trying to tell them they can't have a voice, they can't. I'm not arguing that. All I'm saying is that I want people's perspective on all sides of an issue. And I don't want to cancel anybody. I don't want to silence anybody's ability to exercise their First Amendment right of freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of religion, freedom of have no religion. I'm very much a free speech absolutist. So if you call me a libertarian on that issue, then so be it. But I want to be really clear to the UNT campus. I know more UNT students are listening to the show now, and whole classes are listening to this. I reject cancel culture outright. If you want to cancel somebody's view just because they deviates from your progressive viewpoint or whatever viewpoint, you're violating the First Amendment. The First Amendment is very clear that free speech should not be infringed upon. And how is that not infringing on somebody when you try to cancel their viewpoint? Cancel Dave Chappelle, cancel Pink Floyd, cancel the producers just because you disagree with certain points. Let people's arguments come out strongly. If you don't like it, refute it with sound arguments. Anyways,
Lee, let me interject here because I want to give a little pushback, and I think you'll agree with me on this. I don't think we really are free speech absolutists, because there is one exception to free speech, and that is threats. I'm now going to threaten you, Lee, that if you don't give me $100, I'll shoot you. Now, obviously, I'm not serious. I'm not really making a threat. But suppose I was serious. I should go to jail for that because that is a threat. And a threat to engage in bodily damage would be illegal per se. I mean, that's all an extortionist does. That's all a highwayman does. He says, give me money or I'll shoot you. And often he doesn't shoot you, but he's still a criminal. So with that one minor exception, I agree with you very, very enthusiastically.
Yeah, I don't think, I mean, we're talking specifically about political cancel culture as opposed to social, media related cancel culture. But I think we've come to a place politically in this country where intolerance should no longer be tolerated. And it's not necessarily the fact that these people, shouldn't be allowed to speak, but if I see somebody out on the street waving a swastika flag, I'm probably going to go out there and berate them until I can get them to, get out of there, cuz it's very obvious what that stands for. It's very clear their intent with that. And I don't know if your idea of threats necessarily extends all the way into that realm of just intolerance. But I think if we tolerate these certain intolerances over time, we allow them to accumulate power and it becomes something that we lose control over.
Well, something in the Constitution, I'm very much a constitutionalist. It talks about peaceful assembly. So there's even qualifications, just kind of to back up what Walter is saying. There's even qualifications in the Constitution about freedom of speech. You can't yell fire in a movie theater. You shouldn't make threats. I'm not in any way advocating. So yes, I would say I had qualifications on my free speech absolutism that I don't believe in making threats or yelling fire in a movie theater or trying to hurt somebody or anything. I'm just saying the cognitive argumentation. I'm not trying to cancel progressives being able to speak. I'm not trying to cancel libertarians or anybody for an expressing a view that is unpopular. I just seen a tendency, for example, before we get into the Ukraine, I really want to get into the Ukraine situation from an economic perspective. But
Before we get into Ukraine, I wanted to make another comment. The Nazis had a march in Skokie, Illinois. Skokie, Illinois is a place where a lot of Jewish people live. And Jewish people have suffered more than most from Nazism. And yet the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union, defended the Nazis. Nowadays, the ACLU has gone woke, but in those days, they were magnificent. And I think the Nazis have every right to petition or to march or whatever, as much right as anyone else. The other point about fire in a crowded theater, one of the chapters in my book, Defending the Undefendable, defended yelling fire in a crowded theater. And I was talking about a sadomasochistic theater. And the idea of a sadomasochistic theater is that somebody yells fire and then they all get crushed at the exits. As long as it's between consenting adults, there's nothing per se wrong and as long as there's no fraud. In other words, if the theater announces itself as a sadomasochistic theater and they do whippings or yelling fire or whatever weird things they want to do, God bless them. They have a right to do that as long as they don't involve normal people or reasonable people in sadomasochism. But sadomasochism is something between consenting adults. And there are various ways of engaging in sadomasochism, tying people up and torturing them and burning them with cigarettes, whatever floats your boat, as long as it's between consenting adults. So I would take issue with the idea that yelling fire in a crowded theater is per se a violation of rights. What is meant is when you have an ordinary theater and you don't tell people that it's a sadomasochistic theater, then to yell fire in a crowded theater is certainly a rights violation. It's a criminal act.
Well, I just want to push back real quick on a sadomasochism thing. I want to be real clear to the UNT campus because there's administration now listening to this and stuff like that. So I want to be really clear. In no way am I advocating for Nazis. No way am I advocating for sadomasochism. But this is what I want to say. Oliver Wendell Holmes, he was a Supreme Court justice. I think he was a Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. He argued, Walter, I think it was a 1918 journal article for the Harvard Law Review, that we even have to defend views that we disagree with vigor, because it comes a long time that your view may be unpopular. So the Constitution basically allows for dissenting views. So what, are we just going to only allow a certain perspective to take place? But regarding the sadomasochism thing, when you're talking about that, I would respond by this. There are certain things that in life that a person may not be emotionally capable of. How do I say this? There's certain activities that could be exploitive that a person can partake in, that yes, they gave their cognition to be involved in it, but somehow they've been conditioned in a culture of exploitation that may not be for their benefit. And I don't know, how do you are there activities that a person can be involved in that they give their consent to, but maybe their consent has been altered by external circumstances that they don't have full recourse of their actions, Walter? I mean, like say a person is involved in prostitution, but they've been conditioned to that. They've been in a really broken environment for their whole lives, and they say they give their will to be involved in that prostitution, but really they've been conditioned to be involved in a detrimental kind of context.
To me, it sounds like that voluntary slavery idea, just honestly, because we're conditioned to pay for our health care, but if healthcare was subsidized, nobody would have to sell themselves into slavery in order to get treatment.
I don't know. Walter's going to definitely push back
Yeah.
On healthcare. Government subsidized healthcare is not definitely something Walter's going to argue for there.
Well, look, I think, Lee, the difference between you and I is you're more of a conservative, I'm more of a libertarian. And look, let me be clear that I personally oppose prostitution, sadomasochism, heavy drugs, alcoholism, gambling. I think a lot of them are harmful to people. But as a libertarian, I ask only one question. Should something be legal or illegal? And I only give one answer, namely, it should be illegal if it's a violation of rights. And if I put heroin in my body, I don't see whose rights I'm violating. If I engage in prostitution, there are gigolos, and I'm a good-looking guy, and I could maybe make a living as a gigolo, going to bed with women and charging them for it. Should I go to jail for that? Now, look, I think it's despicable to do that. I think that a proper way of relating to people sexually is not through money, and I certainly abjure that. But the only question for the libertarian is, do I go to jail for that? Does a woman go to jail for engaging in consenting adult behavior? Whether it's sex or sadomasochism or drugs or whatever, and the libertarian says no. But it doesn't mean that the libertarian favors that. That's an entirely separate issue.
Well, Walter, here's where the Christianity thing comes in. I don't usually push back with my Christianity to a libertarian, atheist libertarian, but I've got to on this issue because you brought up the issue of conservatism and whatnot. So here's the thing: you use the word prostitution is despicable. Now, I believe that because my Christian worldview says that it violates the Ten Commandments, clearly violates God's law. So how can you have pass a moral judgment on anything, right or wrong, within itself, unless you have an absolute standard? If we live in atheistic world with no God, with no absolute standard of right or wrong, who's to say that a person can come along and say, well, in my world, prostitution prostitution is awesome. Like, how can you morally judge somebody when you have no moral absolutes, Walter?
Well, I think morality is sort of a matter of taste. I find it despicable, but if a woman or a man wants to engage in it, you know, that's their business. But you see, as a libertarian, I'm only concerned with a very narrow aspect of morality, namely what is proper law. And as a Christian, you don't have to say that they should go to jail for this. You could just say that you think it's improper behavior, unchristian behavior, and people shouldn't do that. But would you put people in jail, Lee, for engaging in prostitution between consenting adults?
Man, that's a tough one. I think my libertarianism, I mean, I've been influenced tremendously by libertarianism, even though you see me more in the conservative realm. And so that's why in a Republican Party, you do have some people like Rand Paul or his dad, Ron Paul. So I have aspects. I don't know about prison or jail. I don't agree with it. I think it's wrong, and I don't. I'm not. But I'm not sure if I want to say prison. And I wasn't very much for the war on drugs that people went to prison for marijuana offenses like for 25 years. I'm not arguing that. But the situation I have is this. Okay, let's say there's an 18-year-old girl who is a prostitute. Okay, her whole culture has been this broken situation where she doesn't know who her father is, and she's had this mother that's been involved in prostitution, and her home has been like a house of ill repute, as they used to call it. She's been conditioned and potentially groomed to be in that situation. So I think there's mitigating circumstances that affect her decision. So I don't have that limited scope. I think I look at the whole picture and would say the whole institution of prostitution is exploitive, shouldn't take place. I'm not saying I want to imprison anybody, except maybe the people that are really at the top, you know, grooming these girls or whatever into this lifestyle, but that's a massive discussion for another day, but I eat the meat and spit out the bones when it comes to libertarianism. I think there's some awesome things, Walter, and that's why I've had you on my show several times, and we'll continue to have you. You're always welcome here. I'm not sure if I agree with everything. I think you have a more of a limited scope on what you're saying libertarianism causes. You're talking about fraud, like Robert Nozick's utopia. What is it, anarchy in the state? There's certain things that violates. Like the only reason why there should be a government is to prevent fraud, right, and a couple other things, right? And so that's kind of where your libertarianism lies, right? Just if it.
Well, I'm an anarcho-capitalist. I don't believe that there should be any government. I think private enterprise should do that. But Lee, I promised you an hour, and it's way more than an hour, and I've got other appointments, so I've got to get off. And unfortunately, we're not going to be able to discuss Ukraine or any of the other several issues that you mentioned. But I'd like to come on your show in a couple of weeks and start off with Ukraine and do some of the other issues that you've mentioned. But
Yeah, you got it. Next time, only Ukraine. We'll do it. Always a great pleasure to have you on, Walter. We love you very much. We'll get you on next time. Why don't you hop off, Walter? Because I'm gonna still could talk with these guys a little bit but I appreciate you, Walter, so much. And next time we're gonna argue about the issue of Ukraine a little bit. Okay. So thank you.
Sounds good. And thanks for having me. And I'm always happy to be on your show again. You
All
the
right.
man.
Thanks a lot.
Take care. Bye.
All right, guys, we're going to let him hop off. So you guys understand what I was getting at? Prostitution is a really big issue there because I think a person can be conditioned into that environment. So I'm going to say it's more than just, there's a lot, I think the whole institution of it is wrong and should be looked at in other than just if that person had the gave their will to be involved in it.
Well, I think ideally we would live in a system that didn't require prostitution to be some people's only means of like wealth. But um yeah, it's kind of like he said. I mean, if we had that ideal system without the moral quandary of any prior conditioning or anything like that, I mean, two consenting adults. And the thing about prostitution that's really interesting to me is it's almost more honest than a one night stand because both parties know exactly what they're getting into. Like when a guy goes to a bar and he picks up some random chick, she doesn't know if she's ever going to see him again. She doesn't know what his intentions are, you know? There's a lot and it can lead to a lot of emotional, you know, friction. And I just think prostitution is a way more clear cut and maybe even, you know, emotionally more sound way of dealing with those natural urges, you know, because both parties know exactly what they're there for. You know, it's just this one thing, just for this amount of money.
I want to be real clear to the UNT audience out there and to people that might be listening to the show that a few things. I don't advocate Nazism. I'm not arguing for fascism. I'm not arguing for legalization of prostitution, legalization of drugs. Some people out there might, that's where libertarians and progressives can agree because a lot of libertarians strongly advocate legalization of drugs. And that's where they can group prostitutes, I mean, with progressives on this. But the thing I want to say is this, and also there are some progressives that support prostitution. Okay, I'm not advocating for these things. I'm just allowing people to express their viewpoints on this. Um, so I want to be really clear because somebody could just isolate one sentence out of this podcast and say at least should be canceled.
Yeah, we beg for context. We beg to be understood within the context of this conversation.
So we got Aiden in here, Aiden Gonzalez. He's you guys can't really see him. A photographer. We're glad you're here. Put up with our crazy show. Brock, what do you got going on for this weekend? Any big games?
I mean, we got Colorado facing Oregon on Saturday. That's gonna be really huge. There's that.
I think Colorado's going to get exposed.
Yep. Teams like Oregon and USC are gonna beat them.
Expose them, right?
Yep.
It's been a wild show. I had a lot of issues, but getting with Walter, a lot of passions get involved in that. I'm not sure if I agree with everything he said. I'm not really sure, but we have different viewpoints on the show. And you guys, I just want to say that something's bothering me over the last 6 months on this campus, where something. So when that speaker, that anti-transgender speaker came on campus, were you guys here when it happened?
That happened.
Yeah.
I don't know anything about that.
Oh yeah, a
I
guy
don't
named
either.
Jeff Younger was invited by Young Conservatives of Texas.
There's that.
He ran for Congress, but evidently his not Congress, but Texas legislature, something like that. And evidently, from his admission, his ex-wife, he said his ex-wife basically influenced their child to change their gender. And he's speaking out against that. And so we had a lot of people from outside the campus caused a ruckus. Eventually, he was shut down from speaking. Now, I can understand blood would boil. I actually argued with the leader of the group who eventually came on the show that maybe there's a different way of doing this. Talking about, maybe there's a different way. But he said, we're not going to shut it down because that violates our free speech. Fair enough. But he actually in fairness, he came on the show and gave an argument. You go in early editions of the show and you can see his point of view. But in the days ahead, we want to get some other people on the show, some very controversial guests. I mean, by the way, the subtitle of the show is America's Most Controversial Podcast. If it's just me and Brock in the studio, just talking about sports, maybe that's not controversial. But hey, Brock, one thing I want to bring up is that Chubb.
Yeah, Nick Chubb, he broke something in his knee last night, and he's going to be out for the season. Where everybody's lucky that it's not more than that, because that injury looked terrible. It was.
You saw it?
I saw it when it happened. It was terrible.
Was knee bent back or something like that?
Pretty much. It was just that. The replay is just disgusting to watch. It was awful.
So, Jackson Carter Palmer, you got a show coming up. You gotta.
Hopefully, I'm working on it right now.
What's it going to be about?
Well, I am starting off with a bang. I think I've got a practitioner of magic, a witch, I suppose you could call them, and I'm going to be talking to them about what the art of magic looks like for them and how they use magic in their everyday lives.
So, one big thing we have for the show is that when I first came to UNT, I said I was not going to get involved in anything. I'm not going to be involved in any shows. I'm just going to get my degree and get out of here. The exact opposite took place. I saw KNT Radio had a table, and they said, "Do you want to have your own show?" And I told myself, "No, don't get involved. Don't go to that table. Don't do it. Don't do it, Lee." I got to the table. And ever since that time, for the last 3 or 4 semesters, I've had a show. But one thing I've tried to do is all three of you guys, I want to see you guys go out and flourish, make a lot of money. Yes, I am a capitalist. I'm not going to lie to you. I am a capitalist. I want to see you guys go out and make buco money and be successful and famous and all that. But if somebody doesn't give you an opportunity, you got to start somewhere, right? So I want to have all of you guys in the studio to give you guys some hands-on training. You're welcome here. Make it happen, guys. But anyways, this is Lee Enochs,
Brock Bergen,
Jackson Carter Pullmeyer.
Aiden Gonzalez. I can't hear that. We're UNT students trying to make a difference. Want different views out there, and have a great evening, guys. God bless.